Here's a thought experiment. You're the young Doris Kearns then, and you're advising LBJ about the lessons of his hero FDR, and he's in the middle of the Vietnam War, and you now know all these lessons about FDR and his conduct in the war. How would you distill them for Johnson, and how could they be useful for him?
Well, I think part of the problem was that he didn't feel confident about his understanding of world affairs. He thought he could extrapolate from his experience with the Congress, where if he would meet with Ho Chi Minh, he could persuade him that somehow he could have a Mekong River television, TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority, and that would make him want to end the war. And FDR would understand, I think, to him that you're fighting ideology, as he was in World War II. You're fighting nationalism. You're fighting much larger issues, and there may not be, in this instance, a compromise. I think Johnson thought, which was a good thing he thought in domestic affairs, that you could somehow get people to bargain with something, but maybe you can't. And obviously, there was no way that FDR could bargain with Hitler or with Mussolini. And I think he would have told him that you have to understand that. And maybe this is not a war that needs to be fought. What are you doing in trying to change people's feelings about nationalism in Vietnam? But most importantly, as I suggested, I think what he would say to him is, if you're going to go into this war, you have to go into it and educate the American people, because the citizens are going to be sending their sons and daughters into battle, and there's nothing more important than understanding why they're there. Johnson so wanted to keep the Great Society going that he didn't want to talk about the war. He hid the appropriations. He didn't have the National Guard come out. And he just thought, maybe I can run these two things together. And then what he was afraid of was not so much even winning the war. He was afraid of losing the war. So he kept putting more troops in to prevent the loss of the war, instead of having a philosophy of whether is this war worth winning or not. But it lost him his presidency. It lost him his place in history. And he was, as I say, he suffered from that as well. So that even though I was so angry with him when I first knew about him when I was in the war, being with him just made me feel more empathetic toward somebody who I believe this isn't what he wanted. When I used to yell, "How many kids did you kill today, LBJ, hey, hey?" That's not what it was about. And I came to feel sad about him and sad about the heartbreak of the country, that this guy could have been and was in many ways an FDR, except for this failure of leadership epic in the war.
One last question on LBJ. You talk about the qualities that the great leaders you describe had, and empathy is a crucial one, and the ability to listen. If Johnson had more of that, would he have been a better leader? Well,
he certainly had empathy in the domestic affairs. I mean, one of the most important experiences he had when he was young, he had to leave college for a year in order to get money, because they couldn't afford to stay in. And he worked as a principal in a Mexican-American school in Cotulla. And he saw the pain of prejudice, he said, on the faces of these kids. And he did everything. He was the principal, he was the teacher, he organized the soccer games, he organized basketball games. Those kids said they've never been in the presence of such an energy. And the oral histories of those kids say he changed their lives. And then much, much later, in 1965, when he's giving the "We Shall Overcome" speech for the voting rights after the Selma demonstrations, which I'm proud to say my husband, Richard Goodwin, worked on that speech. And he was working, he only had that day to write the speech, because Johnson decided on the Sunday night that on the Monday night he was going to give a joint session of Congress speech. So my husband came in that morning, and he said, "You got to write the speech." And somebody had assigned it to a different person the night before, so Johnson said, "How's Goodwin doing on the speech?" I couldn't have done this if my heart depended on it. From 9 in the morning till 6 at night, he wrote that speech. If you look it up, it's so beautiful. You know, every now and then history and fate meet at a certain time in a certain place. So it was in Lexington and Concord. So it was in Appomattox. So it was in Selma, Alabama. And then at a certain point, this is not a Negro problem, not a white problem. It's an American problem. It's going to take us a long time, but we shall overcome. The moment when a president connects to an outside movement and the two of them join forces together, that's the critical moment. But the only time Johnson interrupted my husband working on that speech that day was to call him up and say, "I'd like to talk about Cotulla." And he told my husband the story. So in the speech, he says he remembered being there in 1928, and he saw the prejudice on their face, and he didn't know what he could do about it. But now he had the power to do something, and by God, he was going to do it. I'm going to use it. So those are the moments that Lyndon Johnson should be remembered for as well.
Wonderful.